Margaret Calloway had learned to sleep with one eye open. Not because she wanted to, no woman chooses that kind of life, but because the man she had married 10 years ago had taught her that silence was dangerous and noise was worse. Either way she was never safe. Either way she paid the price. She had met Thomas Calloway at a church social in Sioux Falls in the spring of 1872. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a smile that made the older women in town nudge each other and whisper about good prospects. Margaret had been 19 then, bright-eyed and full of hope, the kind of girl who believed that love was something you built together, brick by brick, with patience and care. She had been wrong. Thomas had laid the foundation of their marriage with charm, then filled it with cruelty once he had her name on paper and a ring on her finger. The first time he struck her, she told herself it would not happen again. The second time she believed it was her fault. By the 5th year of their marriage she had stopped counting and started surviving. She cooked his meals exactly as he liked. She kept the children quiet when he came home smelling of whiskey. She smiled at church, wore long sleeves in summer, and told neighbors she bruised easily. She had become very good at lying. It was the only skill her marriage had given her. But on a cold October night in 1882, something inside Margaret Calloway cracked open like river ice in spring. Thomas had come home angrier than usual. There had been trouble at the mill where he worked, some dispute over wages, and he brought that anger straight through the front door and aimed it at her like a loaded pistol. She had seen the look in his eyes before. She knew what was coming. But this time, for the first time in 10 years, she did not lower her gaze. She looked at him directly. And in that one terrible, quiet moment, she understood something so simple and so devastating that she almost laughed out loud. She was not afraid of him anymore. She was afraid of dying without ever having truly lived. That night, after Thomas passed out in his chair, Margaret packed 2 flour sacks with everything that mattered. Her children's warmest clothes, a little money she had saved 1 coin at a time hidden inside a tea tin, her mother's silver brooch, and a week's worth of dried food. She woke her 2 children, Clara, age 8, and young Henry, barely 6, and she pressed her finger to her lips. They understood immediately. Children who grow up in fear learn the language of silence very quickly. They slipped out the back door into the cold darkness. Margaret did not look back at the house. She had spent 10 years looking back, second-guessing herself, making excuses for a man who had never once shown mercy. Tonight she was done looking back. She put Clara's hand in hers, lifted Henry onto her hip, and walked. She had no plan beyond the single desperate fact that she could not stay. She knew that Thomas would wake up furious. She knew that a woman alone with 2 children on the Dakota prairie in late October was in serious danger from the cold, the distance, and a dozen other threats she could not name. But she also knew what waited for her if she stayed. And that knowledge was enough to put one foot in front of the other, again and again, through the frozen grass and the thin, pale moonlight, until the house disappeared behind her and the wide-open darkness of the plains swallowed them whole. By morning, Margaret's feet were bleeding inside her boots. She had walked through the night without stopping, driven by equal parts terror and determination, but the prairie does not care about human courage. It simply exists, vast, cold, and indifferent. And by the time the gray dawn light began spreading across the horizon, she understood how completely alone they were. Clara walked beside her without complaint, though her small face was pinched with cold and exhaustion. Henry had long since fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder, his weight growing heavier with every mile. Margaret's arms ached. Her back ached. The thin shawl she had wrapped around herself was no match for the October wind that cut across the flat land without mercy or pause. She had been following the river, thinking it would lead her toward the town of Chamberlain, where she had a distant cousin who might take them in. But the river had bent in ways she had not expected, and now she was no longer certain she was heading in the right direction. Fear crept back into her chest, slow and cold as the ground beneath her feet. She pushed it down. She could not afford fear right now. She could afford only forward motion. By mid-morning, Henry woke and said he was hungry. Margaret gave him the last of the cornbread she had packed and watched him eat it with the focused seriousness of a child who does not fully understand why breakfast is being eaten in the middle of a frozen field. Clara said nothing, but she took her mother's free hand and held it tightly. That small grip, those small fingers wrapped around her own, gave Margaret more strength than she had words for. By noon, the sky had turned the color of old pewter and the wind had sharpened. Margaret knew that kind of sky. It meant snow before nightfall. She had no shelter, no fire, and 2 children who were already dangerously cold. She began to pray in the practical, bargaining way of someone who is not entirely sure they are being heard but cannot afford to stop talking. It was Clara who spotted them first. She tugged Margaret's sleeve and pointed to the ridge to the north, where the land rolled upward before flattening again. There were riders up there, 3 of them, sitting on horseback and watching. Margaret's heart stopped. She had heard enough stories about what happened to lone women on the prairie to know that strangers could mean danger as easily as rescue. She pulled both children close and stood very still, as if stillness might make her invisible. The riders came down slowly, without urgency, the way men move when they are not trying to frighten anyone. As they drew closer, Margaret saw that they were Lakota, 3 men on painted horses, wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching her with expressions she could not read. She did not speak their language. She had no idea if they would help her or harm her, and she was too exhausted and too cold to run. The tallest of the 3 dismounted first. He was perhaps 50 years old, with a broad face and dark eyes that held a quality Margaret had never seen in Thomas Calloway's eyes in 10 years of marriage. They held stillness. Not the stillness of threat, but the stillness of a man who was genuinely calm. He looked at her bleeding boots, at her pale shaking children, at the flour sacks she clutched like her life depended on them, because it did. Then he looked at her face. He did not smile, did not speak. He simply reached into the roll behind his saddle and drew out a heavy blanket. He held it toward her. That was all. No words, no conditions, no price. Just a blanket, extended in the direction of a woman who had nothing left but the courage to take it. Margaret Calloway took the blanket. She wrapped it around her children and stood there in the frozen grass, tears running down her wind-burned face, and understood that she had just been saved by a stranger whose name she did not know and whose world she had been taught to fear. His name was Standing Elk. He was a chief among the Lakota people who camped along a bend in the Missouri River, where the cottonwood trees grew thick enough to block the worst of the winter wind and the land sloped gently down to the water. Margaret learned his name by pointing to herself and saying her own, and watching him repeat the motion with the same quiet simplicity. It was, she would later think, the most honest introduction she had ever been given. He and his 2 companions led her and the children to the village, a settlement of perhaps 30 lodges arranged in a careful pattern that Margaret did not immediately understand but would come to appreciate deeply. The village was not what she had expected. She had grown up hearing about the Lakota the way most settlers did, in fearful whispers in newspaper headlines built on panic and misunderstanding. She had expected chaos or hostility, or something she could not name but had been taught to dread. Instead she found order, warmth, and the particular hum of a community that knows how to take care of its own. Women came out to look at them. Children too, bright-eyed, curious children who stared at Clara and Henry with the same open fascination that Clara and Henry directed back at them. One of the older women, a small, sturdy person with silver-streaked hair and an expression that suggested she had seen everything twice and was surprised by nothing, took one look at Margaret's boots, clicked her tongue in a way that needed no translation, and immediately took charge. Margaret and the children were brought into a lodge, which was warmer than Margaret had expected, and given food. It was a simple stew, but it was hot and deeply nourishing, and Margaret ate it with the desperate gratitude of someone who had not been properly warm or fed in nearly 2 days. Henry fell asleep before he finished his bowl. Clara sat close to her mother's side and watched everything with serious, careful eyes. Over the days that followed, Margaret lived in a state of constant bewilderment mixed with a growing, cautious wonder. She could not communicate with most of the people around her beyond gestures and expressions, and yet she was never treated with unkindness. She was given clothes when her own proved inadequate for the weather. She was shown, through patient demonstration, how to do useful things around the camp. She was included without being pressured, welcomed without being questioned. Standing Elk visited each evening. He was learning English words with a focus and seriousness that she found deeply moving, not because he needed her approval but because he clearly believed that the ability to speak to another person in their own language was a form of respect. He brought a young man with him sometimes, a nephew who spoke better English, and through this awkward but earnest bridge of translation, they began to actually talk. She told him, piece by piece, what she was running from. She did not soften it or apologize for it because she was too tired for that and because something in the way he listened made her feel that the truth was acceptable here. He listened without interrupting. When she was done he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, through the nephew, that a man who strikes his wife is not a man. That a woman who walks through the night to protect her children has the heart of a warrior. No one had ever called Margaret a warrior. The word landed somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there, warm and solid like an ember that refuses to go out. She did not know what to say. So she said nothing and let the word be enough. The days turned into a week. The week stretched toward 2. The snow that had threatened on that first afternoon finally came, and it came hard, burying the prairie under a heavy white silence that made travel impossible. Margaret realized, without panic and without grief, that she was not going anywhere for a while. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that was perfectly all right. Margaret had always thought of peace as an absence. The absence of noise, the absence of danger, the absence of Thomas Calloway's heavy footsteps coming down the hall. But living among Standing Elk's people, she began to understand that peace was not an absence at all. It was a presence. It was something active and alive, built every day through small acts of care, through attention, through the choice to treat the person in front of you as though they mattered. She watched this happen all around her. She watched the women work together without resentment, sharing tasks and laughter in equal measure. She watched the older people be treated not as burdens but as repositories of knowledge, consulted and honored. She watched the men with the children, not distant and detached the way Thomas had been, but present and playful and gentle in ways she had not thought men were capable of being. And she watched Standing Elk, who moved through his community the way water moves through a landscape, without force, without drama, shaping everything around him by simply being what he was. He was not a simple man. She understood that quickly. He carried the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders in ways that were becoming increasingly desperate as the seasons changed and the old ways of life were compressed and threatened by forces that came from the east with treaties that were written in English and broken in English and replaced with new ones that were broken in turn. He was a man navigating an impossible situation with whatever dignity and intelligence he could bring to bear. The fact that he still had laughter in him, quiet, sudden, genuine laughter that surprised her every time, struck Margaret as one of the most remarkable things she had ever witnessed. Clara thrived in a way that broke Margaret's heart with joy. Within 10 days she was running with the other children, communicating through a rapid, invented mixture of gestures and borrowed words that children seem to develop naturally when language is no barrier to play. Henry followed his sister everywhere, round-faced and happy, growing stronger in the cold, clean air. Watching them, Margaret felt a guilt she had to work to understand. Not guilt for leaving, never that, but guilt for how long she had stayed. For how many years she had tried to make something work that had never been designed to work. For the childhood she had not been able to give her children until now. Standing Elk noticed her watching the children one evening. He came and stood beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then he said, slowly and carefully in the English he was building word by careful word, that her children were good, strong, that they would be all right. She asked him how he could know that. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the children in the firelight. Then he said that children who have a mother willing to walk through the night for them, those children know what love is. And children who know what love is can survive most things. Margaret turned that over in her mind for days. It rearranged something in her. She had spent 10 years believing that staying was the right thing, that leaving was selfish, that her suffering was the price of her children's stability. She had been devastatingly wrong. The stability she had given them was the stability of fear, of held breath, of waiting for the next blow. What Standing Elk's words gave her was the understanding that the bravest thing she had ever done, that midnight walk through the frozen dark, was also the most loving thing she had ever done. For them. And though it took her longer to admit it for herself, she began to learn pieces of the Lakota language. She was not talented at it and she made mistakes that caused gentle amusement around the fire, but she kept trying. She helped with the work she was shown how to do. She told stories to the children in the evenings, and a small audience of young Lakota children gathered to listen even though they did not understand the words, drawn in by her expressions and her voice. She did not know exactly who she was becoming. But she was becoming someone. That was more than she could have said 1 month ago. Spring came to the Missouri River country slowly and then all at once, the way it always does on the northern plains. The snow melted in stages, leaving the ground dark and rich, and the cottonwoods along the river erupted into pale green almost overnight. Margaret stood at the river's edge one morning in early April and felt something she could only describe as possibility, not the fragile, uncertain kind she had known in her girlhood, but something heavier and more reliable, like ground that has been tested and found solid. She had been with Standing Elk's people for nearly 5 months. She had learned enough of the language to hold simple conversations and understand more than she could express. She had made herself genuinely useful, and more than that, genuinely connected, to the silver-haired woman named Wax Far who had taken her under her wing in those first days, to several of the younger mothers, to the children who called her by a name she couldn't quite pronounce herself but that made the elders smile when they heard it. She had also been sending letters, when the opportunity arose, through a trader who made winter rounds and who, for a small fee that she paid in mended clothing, carried messages to the nearest settlement. She had written to her cousin in Chamberlain. She had written to a woman she trusted from her church back in Sioux Falls. And she had written, carefully and clearly, to a lawyer whose name she had read once in a newspaper advertisement, asking about the legal possibility of ending a marriage to a man who had broken her bones and stolen her years. The lawyer's reply came in March. It was cautious and conditional, full of the difficult language of the law, but the heart of it was clear. It was possible. It would not be easy. Thomas Calloway would fight it because men like Thomas Calloway fight everything they feel entitled to own. But it was possible. Standing Elk read the letter with her, slowly, and when she told him what it meant, he nodded in the careful way he had. The nod that said he understood and that he did not need to make the moment bigger than it already was. He told her that she should do what she needed to do. He told her that she and her children were welcome to stay as long as they needed to, and that leaving when the time came would not end the friendship that had been made here. That friendships made in hard times were made of something stronger than ordinary material. She left in May, when the ground had dried enough for travel and her cousin had sent word that she had room and that she wanted to help. Clara and Henry said their goodbyes with the intensity of children who have formed real bonds, and the other children crowded around them with the slightly stunned seriousness of young people experiencing a real farewell, perhaps for the first time. Walks Far pressed something into Margaret's hand, a small carved piece of bone, smooth and curved, on a leather cord. She tied it around Margaret's neck without explanation, and Margaret did not ask for one. Some gifts explain themselves. Standing Elk walked with her to where the trail turned north. They stood for a moment in the spring light, the river running behind them, the sky enormous and blue overhead. He said something in Lakota that she mostly understood and then one sentence in his careful English, that she was not the same woman who had walked out of the dark onto that ridge in October. Margaret looked at him, this man who had handed her a blanket instead of a threat, who had called her a warrior, who had shown her through the simple evidence of his own life that human beings were capable of treating each other with dignity and grace, and she said that she knew, that she was grateful, that she would not forget. She meant it. She kept it. The legal process took 3 years and cost her more than she had and took more out of her than she expected. But she did not give up, and eventually the law gave her what Standing Elk's people had given her on that first freezing night, a way forward. She built a small life in Chamberlain, work, a home, her children growing into people she was proud of. She wrote to Standing Elk when she could, and sometimes he wrote back in careful, improving English that always made her smile. She never forgot the river camp, or the warmth of that first stew, or the word warrior, or the way peace had felt when she finally understood what it actually was. She had fled her husband's rage across a frozen prairie with nothing but her children and her courage. And she had found, in the most unexpected place, the life she had always deserved.